Welcome back, U.S. history students. I hope everyone is doing well today. We're going to be continuing focusing on the civil rights movement today. Last week, you guys had an ed puzzle focusing kind of an overview of the civil rights movement. And then on Thursday and Friday, you had an opportunity to look at the very, very famous Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case and the Little Rock school desegregation process. And so we're going to continue looking at this civil rights movement this coming week. And we're going to be looking at some of kind of the most impactful events and themes from this movement. Okay, so for today, we've got our aim, and it's how can we compare and contrast the Montgomery bus boycotts and lunch counter sit-ins to identify the goals of civil rights protests. So we're really looking into the goals of civil rights protests, and we're going to be looking at two kind of very famous examples of these civil rights protests. The first one is going to be the Montgomery bus boycotts, and once again, the title is going to tell us a lot. It's taking place in Montgomery, Alabama, all right, and it's dealing with the boycotting of the bus system in that city. And remember, to boycott means to refuse to use, to stop using that good or service, okay? We're also going to be looking into the lunch counter sit-ins today, okay? And once again, the title tells us a lot. It's a sit-in. It is a group of people who are sitting in at various restaurants for a very clear purpose. And what our job is today is to try to figure out what are their goals. What is their purpose in taking part in these bus boycotts and these sit-ins? Okay, so for our do now, we're going to be reflecting on what we did yesterday. Okay, so it's asking you to summarize the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling. What changes did this make to American society? So it's a two-part question. Okay, we want to identify first just a summary of what's going on with this case, and then how does this case change American society? Okay, you can pause the video to work on that do now on your handout. We can come back together and we will hit the fast facts together. Okay, so the fast facts for today. The first fast fact is dealing with a very, very influential group during the civil rights movement, but also very influential up to modernity. All right, this group still exists, the NAACP. It's founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, and it's trying to gain changes in the civil rights era through court cases. So one of the major things that the NAACP tries to do is they try to challenge unfair laws in American society, laws that are focusing on segregation. All right, and they use the courts as a way to try to change those laws. All right, and early on, the NAACP has some mixed success. A lot of times, unfortunately, they're running into courts that are still very racist in their operations. So a lot of cases where rights are clearly violated are either not heard or the court refuses to acknowledge those problems because racism is still very much persistent in those communities. All right, one of the major successes of the NAACP, though, is this Brown versus Board versus Board of Education case. And as we learned about last week, the Supreme Court switches their viewpoint on the legality of segregation. Remember Plessy versus Ferguson, late 1800s, the Supreme Court rules that segregation is legal as long as the facilities are separate but equal. Brown versus Board throws that theory away. And Brown versus Board says the facilities being separate but equal is inherently unequal. Once you separate people based on their race, you are treating them unequally. So Brown versus Board throws out this idea that establishes the legality of segregation But we need to remember that Brown versus Board is dealing with schools, so in a school setting. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure equality in all other facets of life in America. Okay, so we see that Brown versus Board is a great start. It's a starting point, but there's still efforts to gain more change. And you see that organizations emerge that focus on non-violent protests. Okay, and nonviolent protests are very important for us today because this is kind of an umbrella term we're going to be using, and then underneath that umbrella, we're going to be looking at specific instances of nonviolent protest. Okay, from your global history studies. All right, very famous example of an individual who uses nonviolent protests is Gandhi. Okay, Nelson Mandela in South Africa is also credited with utilizing some nonviolent protest tactics as well. Okay, so for us today, our two examples of nonviolent protests we're going to be looking into, Montgomery bus boycotts and the lunch counter sit-ins, are two of the most famous nonviolent protests of the civil rights era. And this last bullet's really important because it's really kind of explaining the purpose and methodology behind those nonviolent protests. So we see that these nonviolent protests are trying to highlight unfair practices in society. And for the most part, these practices discriminated against African Americans. And what this is trying to do is it's trying to pressure society, it's trying to pressure these laws to change. The idea being that if enough people are kind of notified, or if enough people are informed about these unfair practices that still exist in society, there's going to be a lot of pressure on those cities, on those towns, on those states to make changes. And Martin Luther King Jr. is kind of on the forefront of this nonviolent protest movement, with his idea being that there needs to be societal pressure to bring about change. And he believed that to get society on your side, you must work in a nonviolent manner. Okay, we'll compare Martin Luther King Jr. With Malcolm X on Wednesday, who has a very different stance on how change should be accomplished for African Americans. Okay, in the PowerPoint, you have some images provided to you. On the left-hand side, you have two images from the Montgomery bus boycotts. You see that a lot of people during the Montgomery bus boycotts kind of figure out different means of transportation. A lot of people walk. You see a heightened use of carpooling in Montgomery, but it's a prolonged period where people refuse to use the buses. And this is a picture below showing how the ridership of the buses plummets during this boycott. And in the text that you're going to be reading, you'll figure out how this actually leads to change. All right, on the right-hand side, you see a couple of images from the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins. Woolworths is a famous location where these lunch counter sit-ins are kind of sparked. And once again, you'll read in the text more about what the lunch counter sit-ins kind of embodied, but how they attempted to bring about change as well. So when we shift to our document for the day, okay, you'll see that you have a table, and you're going to be looking at the bus boycotts on the left-hand side, lunch counter sit-ins on the right-hand side. The texts today, they're not in this document. You have a separate document titled Readings, okay, and you'll see that there's an article that's provided to you focusing on the bus boycotts, then an article focusing on the lunch counter sit-ins. Okay, so you should be using those articles to fill in your summary charts. Okay, remember, we need to be detailed. Some people are still giving a couple words for an answer. You guys, it needs to be full sentences. It needs to be detailed. Okay, to conclude, you have a summary task. Once again, a lot of times one sentence isn't a really strong answer for these summary task questions. Okay, don't just do the bare minimum. All right, think through the questions, explain your reasoning, give detailed explanations, and bring in evidence from the sources to support your answers. Okay. We're getting into the start of marking period 3. Okay, a lot of people did some really good work during marking period 2. Let's keep that up and finish strong through the end of the year. As always, if you have any questions, concerns, feel free to reach out to me. Okay, I'll try to have some Google Meet sessions this week to extend some support. Hope everyone is doing well. Talk to you guys soon.